Good evening. Tonight we're doing something a little different at Critical Cult News because tonight we are dedicating the entire show to one story. Yet, of course, this is not just one story, but the story of millions of people who have been fighting for their very survival for over a century. It's not just the story of one tribe, but many tribes locked in a millennia-old struggle without any easy resolution or even a clear vision of what victory would actually look like. Tonight, we are talking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the recent events that have exploded this war onto the front pages of every major media outlet, and which are still tonight consuming the time and attention of the entire world. In discussing the history and events which make up the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we are attempting to navigate an immensely complicated and highly charged subject. We appreciate the fact that views on this subject can be, in a word, intense, and that any effort to speak about this in an objective or unbiased way will automatically be interpreted by some as siding with their perceived enemies. Even now, right here in the United States, violence is being committed daily by supporters on both ends of this conflict. And where overt violence has not been utilized, social cancellation and shunning are in full effect against anyone who publicly criticizes one side or the other. Such is the way of things when wading into conflicts in which the very survival of both sides is hanging in the balance. And that is ultimately what is going on here. It's all too easy and unfortunately all too common for Americans or people who don't really understand the bigger picture to read a single story or read about the latest attacks and believe they have a clear idea of who is right and who is wrong and what this is all about. Unfortunately, this is one of those times when that simply isn't going to cut it. When words fail again and again to settle such conflicts, raised fists and guns become the new methods of communication, and such has been the case in the Middle East for a very long time. So-called cultic or extreme behavior has become the order of the day, with extreme solutions being the only acceptable ones. The mountains of propaganda that follow in the wake of such violence are not only formidable, but often can be quite convincing as to who has the moral high ground. But that's not necessarily the best way to interpret reality. We know from history, psychology, and sociology that when emotions and groupthink rule our behavior, social disasters follow inevitably in their wake. And this is why we must comment on the fact that so much blood has been spilled by so many men, women, and children on both sides of this for so many decades. So many atrocities and war crimes have been committed by both sides against the other that traditional concepts such as right and wrong or good and bad simply cease to have any real meaning when trying to determine which side is correct. Yet we can still try to understand why this is happening, who and what caused it to occur, and perhaps in finding such meanings we can also find possible solutions to end the endless violence, and perhaps imagine a future where peaceful coexistence is possible. To begin, we will first clarify a common misconception about why this conflict is going on when it comes to religion and theological differences between Islam and Judaism. The Israelis are, of course, a Jewish people, but they find common identity in their Judaic heritage more so than their Judaic beliefs or system of worship. The Palestinians are an Arab people who have lived for many centuries in the contested regions which Israel is making claim to. Both claim to be descended from biblical patriarchs, although there is a great deal of genealogical and historical research which refutes or at least heavily modifies these claims. But regardless of historical or DNA records, the basis of the violence around the holy city of Jerusalem and its sacred sites is not actually an issue of clashing theology so much as clashing nationality. In other words, no one is fighting over whether to celebrate Yom Kippur or Ramadan, or how to interpret scriptures from the Old Testament, or how many angels dance on the head of a pin. While religious beliefs do play a role in why the Israelis and Arabs believe they are the rightful owners of the land they are fighting over, at its core, this conflict is one of nationalism and land ownership. The land of Canaan, also called Eretz Israel, meaning the land of Israel, was, according to the Hebrew Bible, promised by God to the children of Israel. This is also mentioned in the Quran. It was this principle which a Jewish man named Theodor Herzl adopted as the central tenet of his 1896 manifesto called the Jewish State, in which Herzl not only repeatedly refers to the biblical promised land, but asserts that Jews all over the world should immigrate to and take this promised land for themselves. He was not asserting they should form a theocratic Jewish state centered around the Jewish religion, but instead should come together as a people to form a country in which they would have the national identity that had been denied the Jews since before the time of Christ. The promised land, Herzl proposed, should be a nation of Jewish people, not a nation that practices the Judaic religion. This was the beginning of what is known as Zionism, or the Zionist movement. And this is when the land we now call Israel became a hotbed of conflicting views as to who should be there and why. At the same time Herzl and the Jewish people were coming around to this point of view, Muslims were also claiming rights to that land according to how they interpreted the Quran. While Herzl claimed that land was promised only to the descendants of Abraham's grandson Jacob, they argued that the land of Canaan was promised to them since they were descended from Abraham's elder son Ishmael. And to complicate matters even further, both sides share a reverence for the same religious holy sites, such as the Cave of the Patriarchs and the Temple Mount. In the past 1,400 years, Muslims have constructed Islamic landmarks on these ancient Israelite sites, such as the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount, which also happens to be the holiest site in Judaism. This has brought the two groups into conflict over the rightful possession of Jerusalem, which is near the geographical center of the contested territories. And to complicate things even more, there are Christians who openly support the Jewish claim to the land of Israel because they believe the return of Jews to Israel is a prerequisite for the second coming of Christ. So the bottom line is that while there are religious reasons involved in why each side believes they should live on and own the contested land, the conflict is over the land and not over their different religious practices or ideas. That is why we don't have to go back thousands of years to try to understand or even resolve what the fighting's all about. That's why we can follow the lead of most historians and begin looking at the history of this conflict in the late 19th century and frame it through the lens of competing nationalities. The time period was one of flourishing nationalistic attitudes in Europe, especially in the Habsburg Austro-Hungarian Empire, where different groups all wanted their own nation-state. In the middle of that movement, Theodor Herzl became convinced that rather than continuing to live assimilated in other nations, it was time for the Jewish people to have a nation of their own. This was the birth of Jewish nationalism, or what more popularly was known as Zionism. This was not a movement based in religious belief or practice, as many Zionists were secular Jews who were not trying to find religious freedom, but instead they were looking for national identity. The trouble started when, in 1917, the British government tried to gain the support of the Jewish people in their fight against the German and Ottoman empires, which were allied against the Western nations. To this end, the British Prime Minister issued what became known as the Balfour Declaration, promising, quote, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, end quote. Of course, at the time, the Brits didn't own Palestine, as it was still technically Ottoman. But that didn't stop the British government from not only making this promise to the Jewish people, but at the same time, they were double dealing with the French. You see, in 1916, a year before the Balfour Declaration, the British had secretly promised the French that they would divide up the Arab territories and the Brits would keep Palestine. And as though this wasn't bad enough, the British also promised Sharif Hussein, the ruler of Mecca, that he would be in charge of an Arab state, including Palestine, if he led an Arab revolt against the Ottomans, which he did. The Arabs at the time were the majority landowners and occupants of the region. So with the same piece of land promised by the British to three competing factions, none of whom knew about the other promises the British were making, this was a powder keg waiting to go off. After the end of World War I, the British established a colony in Palestine, stating that they were just going to remain there until the Palestinians were ready to rule themselves. While the Palestinians felt they were ready for self-rule immediately, unfortunately, the British purposefully made that impossible by establishing separate institutions for Christians, Jews, and Muslims. This was not an accident, but a premeditated effort to divide and rule the mixed inhabitants of Palestine in the usual British colonial way. At the same time, between 1920 and 1939, the Jewish population of Palestine increased by over 320,000 people, many of whom were emigrating to Palestine to escape the brutal prejudicial treatment they were receiving across Europe as Nazis and fascists came to power in Germany and Italy. Efforts to escape to America or other regions of safety were continually thwarted or stopped outright, convincing Jews more and more that a Jewish state was their only real option for a future. Given what occurred in Germany and the surrounding regions during the 1930s and 40s, it's hard to argue they were wrong. By 1938, the Jewish population was just under 30% of Palestine, a fact which greatly alarmed all of the Palestinians who were already living there. To add fuel to the fire, the Jews were focusing their efforts on buying land from absentee, non-Palestinian Arab landowners, and then evicting Palestinian farmers who were living and working there. The Jewish people considered they were establishing a more secure homeland for themselves by gaining control of the land and the labor. But this only increased the tensions of the Arab population. And this sparked a parallel nationalistic movement on the part of the Arab Palestinians, people also without a national identity, despite the years of having lived in a common territory under common rule. That growing sense of nationalism erupted in 1936 when the Palestinians revolted against the British. The Brits at this point were attempting to fulfill their promise from the Balfour Declaration and brutally suppress the Palestinian revolt with the help of Jewish militias. The atrocities committed by the British and Jews during this time against the Palestinians is well documented and horrifying. Following the suppression of the Palestinians to gain self-rule, the British attempted to offer some concessions to the Arab Palestinians in a new policy which limited Jewish immigration to Palestine and called for the establishment of a joint Arab and Jewish state within 10 years. The British government was now trying to put a Band-Aid over the open wound they had inflicted against the people in the region. It was far too little and far too late. Open hostilities were now the order of the day, with Arabs and Jews fighting with their fists and their money to suppress or hurt each other's communities. World War II managed to break up these hostilities for a time, and things were actually relatively peaceful in the region while the rest of the world was drawn into that conflict. But right after World War II ended, the Palestinian hostilities resumed. Rather than deal with the mess they had created, the British decided they didn't want to run a Palestinian colony anymore, and they pulled out, turning the problem over to the newly formed United Nations. In November of 1947, the UN voted for what was called the Partition Plan, where they sectioned off Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish states. How anyone imagined this was going to work is beyond our understanding, as the plan called for two states which were roughly equal in size, but were not equal in terms of access to resources, especially water, which is somewhat crucial to living in the region. The partitions also looked like a jigsaw puzzle. Even with assistance from neighboring Arab states, though, the Israelis won, and when an armistice was signed in 1949, Israel occupied a third more land than they would have under the UN proposal. And they immediately exiled 700,000 Palestinians, who fled their homes and became refugees in the neighboring Arab countries. In the aftermath of all this, the nation of Jordan annexed the West Bank and the old city of Jerusalem, while Egypt controlled the Gaza Strip. To Israelis, this was the beginning of their nation. To the Palestinians, it was the Nakba, the catastrophe, as they became stateless. Conflicts continued for the next 18 years, but nothing changed in terms of land ownership until 1967, when Israel and several Arab states went to war again. It was called the 6 Days War. Israel won the fight and as a result gained control over the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights. The UN attempted to bring order by passing Resolution 242, which outlined a basic framework for achieving peace, including Israel withdrawing from the territory acquired in the war and all participants recognizing the rights of both a Palestinian and an Israeli state to exist. While Israel did give back some of the land they had acquired, they claimed more territory in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. These Jewish settlements continued to encroach on Arab Palestinian land, forcing more and more Palestinians to live in a smaller and smaller space, and ensuring that the hatred and conflict would continue unabated. In response, the Palestinian Liberation Organization was formed in 1964, led by Yasser Arafat. The PLO used violent and nonviolent approaches to try to achieve a Palestinian state, including the killing of non-combatants and civilians in what were often described as terrorist tactics. There are now over 350,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank and over 200,000 in East Jerusalem, and these settlements are illegal, according to international law. But Israel counters by saying that they aren't really illegal because Palestine isn't really a state. By the late 1980s, Palestinians launched the first Intifada, which literally means shaking off. It was at this time that Hamas began, a group which was not just involved in terrorist activities, such as the first suicide bombing against Israel in 1993, but which had gained a great deal of support from its social welfare projects in Gaza. It built and staffed schools, mosques, and clinics. The first Intifada led to the Oslo Accords and the peace process, a very challenging prospect at this point given the entrenched positions of both the Jewish and Palestinian peoples, who both wanted more land and more resources for themselves. Then came the Clinton talks in the early 90s, which appeared to result in some forward progress, until they didn't. Then, in September of 2000, Prime Minister candidate Ariel Sharon led a group of 1,000 armed guards to the Temple Mount in the Old City of Jerusalem. To Muslims, this is known as the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and it's the third holiest site in Islam, behind only the Kaaba in Mecca and the Prophet's Mosque in Medina. And it's the holiest site in Judaism, making this act the match that lit more of the powder keg this region is. A massive protest against this march led to the much more violent Second Intifada, in which more than 3,000 Palestinians and 1,000 Israelis were eventually killed. In 2002, the Israelis, claiming to act in defense of civilians, began construction of a wall around the West Bank. But instead of following the borders established after the 1967 war, the barrier was built to include many Israeli settlements on the Israeli side. To Israelis, that was about self-defense. To Palestinians, it was an illegal land grab. Then, in 2005, Yasser Arafat died, and in an election shortly thereafter, Hamas won a majority of the parliamentary seats. Since then, Hamas and the Palestinian Authority have both been sort of in charge of governing Palestine, and it's been a rocky road. Over the last decade, Hamas has launched frequent rocket attacks into Israel, who have responded with increased force, invading Palestinian territory and killing thousands in the process. When such rocket launches and invasions happen on both ends, the casualties inevitably include many civilians and children, not just military personnel. Both parties claim to be responding to the provocations of the other, but much of the conflict reflects the consistent failure on all sides to understand the legitimacy of the other's narrative. And this really is where we come down to the heart of the matter. The contradictory and conflicting narratives both sides tell themselves and the world about who and what they are and what they are trying to accomplish. To Palestine, The Palestinian people have been denied a state, not just since the formation of Israel, but also for decades before that. And now they live under what amounts to a military occupation in which the basic human rights we take for granted are merely a fantasy they can dream about. In modern Palestine, violent atrocities are a daily way of life. Almost anyone can be dragged from their homes and then watch those homes burned at the hands of their oppressors. Regardless of which side you see as right or wrong, these are all true facts. Now, to Israel, the Jewish people need a homeland. This is a position they are intractable on and have been determined to make a reality since Zionism was established over a century ago. This concept of a homeland is not an option. It is a moral and cultural imperative so that the Jewish people can survive as a people with their identity and heritage intact and in which they can create their own future. The United Nations established and mandated the existence of their Israel, and they have no intention of giving any of it up. And to be blunt, Israel is not the first and won't be the last nation state to consolidate and increase their territory by force of arms. In this, they have a willing and active ally in the United States. The U.S. government has unequivocally backed the Israeli government at every step and currently supports any and all means, violent and otherwise, that Israel cares to engage in to own and control the territory they claim as their own. Israel has benefited greatly from this aid over the decades and has needed it since they are quite literally in a region where they are surrounded by enemy nations who want them gone, preferably permanently. The hostilities are real, the danger constant. These are the positions of these two warring states, and neither is interested in giving any ground at all for any reason. And yet, this is a kind of double bind that prevents any solution from ever coming forward. If one understands clearly the internal logic of these competing nationalist visions, the entire problem becomes all too clear. As writer and educator John Green said, quote, "For both Zionists and Palestinian national visions to eventually work, it's necessary to understand the right of each to exist and the legitimacy of each other's historical narrative." End quote. Until that can be achieved, there won't be an end to the hostilities. As we usually now do when presenting news stories, we'd like to offer some editorial commentary about the cultic aspects presented in this story. And here we are more challenged than by any other story we've ever discussed. The cult-like elements of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict are not easy to define, as they involve a complex mix of religious, national, ethnic, and ideological factors. However, despite the complexity, we can observe certain cultic activity and belief that are true on both sides of this conflict. The use of violence and terror as a means of achieving political or religious goals, often justified by a divine mandate or historical mission. The demonization and dehumanization of the enemy, often based on stereotypes and prejudices, and the rejection of any dialogue or compromise with them. The glorification of martyrdom and sacrifice for the cause, and the celebration of death over life. The attachment to sacred symbols and places, such as Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, or the Western Wall, and the willingness to fight for them at any cost. The belief in an apocalyptic scenario or a messianic vision that will bring about the ultimate victory or salvation for one's group. And while these are all cultic facets of this story, none of them apply to all Palestinians or Israelis, nor do they explain the entire conflict. There are also many voices and movements that oppose violence, extremism, and fanaticism, and seek peace, justice, and coexistence. The conflict is not only a religious one, but also a political one that involves issues such as land, borders, settlements, refugees, security, and human rights. Therefore, it is important to avoid oversimplifying or generalizing the situation and to acknowledge the diversity and complexity of both sides. So instead of trying to frame this as a cult problem, we've tried to look at this through a few different lenses. But let's be very clear that here at home in the United States, there's a great deal of extremist and cult-like behavior occurring all over. Jewish and Palestinian businesses have been firebombed or vandalized. Individuals suspected of not being on the quote-unquote right side have been viciously attacked physically, socially canceled, their livelihoods threatened, and their families put in danger. In the name of supporting their side as the good or righteous one, people are engaging in some of the most evil behavior imaginable right on our city streets. There is no need in this country to be demonstrating any violence toward either side. America is a melting pot, which only works when we are mutually cooperative and tolerant. But that's not what we are seeing in the days since these Hamas attacks began. When the only victory we can imagine is the slaughter of every man, woman, and child on the other side, quote unquote, it is the opinion of this commentator that we have somehow lost the part of ourselves that we call human. We can become so encased in our own righteousness that we will never be able to enact the sane, rational, or reasonable vision of the future we believe we are killing and dying for. It is only when we can regain that humanity, when we can see our enemies as human beings first, who also deserve the same human rights we want for ourselves, it is only then that we will see an end to this conflict. Thank you for watching.